I think when I was kind of thinking about this panel, I was kind of reflecting on like the history of vaults, and I think many of us have been around in crypto for many years. Maybe remember Yearn and kind of this original generation of vaults of just sort of very simple yield farming, totally on-chain automated. Now it seems like more and more I look at stuff like HLP, I look at stuff like JLP, and a lot of these other sort of vaults that are coming out. What do you think is like the biggest difference between sort of this older generation of vaults and like newer generation of vaults? Like, why are we even having this panel in 2025 versus 2020?
I kind of think of the original vaults, like DeFi Summer era vaults, like the Yearn, Pickle, whatever, like that whole copy pasta fork era, was really focused on just aggregation, which is take a bunch of capital, there's a bunch of yield sources, aggregate them, give it to you as like a single package. I think those vaults obviously were also not really managed in a lot of ways. They were purely on-chain smart contracts. There was no parameter updates, and you would have these crazy things like Pickle Finance, where it would be like promising you X 100% APY, but you couldn't withdraw because they didn't do any liquidity management. So like there's no available assets. Like there's duration risk that wasn't mentioned. I think since kind of 2020, vaults have kind of evolved into having a bunch of different atomic units. So I would call there's sort of some sets of vaults that are what I call like primitive vaults. So those are vaults where they are actually the source of the yield. So, in the case of lending protocols, things that are matching borrowers and lenders and charging a fee, that is sort of the sense in which they are the source of the yield. They're not just aggregating other packages. Perpetuals vaults, it's a similar thing where they're sort of close to where the yield is actually being generated. And then there's things that are aggregative. But I think what people have learned is A, how to think about the risks, B, how to think about liquidity management, which was sort of the death knell for the Yearns of the world, where once people realize that I put in $1 million in and I can't withdraw for 6 months, everyone was just like, why am I using this, right? And I think we've evolved to a point where like the liquidity management and risk management have evolved along the way. But yeah, I think that's sort of the natural evolution.
I mean, Cindy, you're one of the co-founders of Drift, one of the largest perpetual DEXs. You guys also, more recently launched your own vaults products, which are now over 200 mil TVL. Congrats. What made you decide to want to launch vaults alongside Drift? How do you sort of see the two relating to each other?
So the reason we launched vaults was that there were a lot of high frequency traders in the game. And then there are a lot of retail traders. There are also people who just want to deposit their assets into a vault where other hedge fund managers are already running. So we wanted to provide a simple way for users to one-click deposit into a product where they can rely on the risk management of somebody professional trading funds to be able to manage risk on top of them. I mean, if you're running 20x leverage on the platform, that's one side of the business. But the bigger play is how can we actually make a on-chain hedge fund that anyone can deposit into, earn up to 30% annualized, and minimize the risk on those products, right? And talking about the evolution of vaults, I think we started off by seeing only spot vaults, where very simple products. It's like single asset, LSD staking type of vaults. Now we're seeing really complex strategies pop up, like depositing a yield-bearing token and then shorting the underlying perpetuals product on top of it to get a delta neutral product. If you're somebody who's just click trading on an exchange, you wouldn't actually know how to manage your risk on all these fronts. So we built vaults as a simple way for people to get access to these strategies. You don't need much capital to invest. You can invest with like $10, $100, but you get access to all of Tarun's magic, right? That you wouldn't be able to do on your own. So
you're like a matchmaker, it's like
exactly
capital, you have the talent, and you have a beautiful couple together. I guess for Lewis and Kyle, or fund managers, how do you guys think about how vaults relate to your business? Is this something where you're going and like actively managing and almost sort of taking in new LPs? Is it something that you guys are looking to deploy into, or are you looking to deploy into sort of vault protocols? Like how do you sort of think about those different parts of the ecosystem?
Yes, so I think, touching on the 2 points that was discussed, I think the landscape has changed and became better because of the universe of options that are available, right? I think back when DeFi started, 2020, 2021, liquidity farming, yield farming was just LPing into simple DEX pools. So it was one-dimensional. But today, with the tokenization of various assets, RWA strategies, the universe of opportunities became a lot more multidimensional and also greater in magnitude. And one thing that I always say to investors or liquidity providers when I'm talking about using money is, today you can't just rock up and say, hey, I want to earn yield in DeFi, and I'm just going to deposit one click and passively wait. Today's strategies are extremely complex, like what Cindy said. Different types of layers of hedging. You need to understand risks. Gauntlet obviously does a really good job in terms of that as well. And so the normal user is starting to get more and more marginalized, and I think increasingly so. Strategies are starting to become more and more exclusive to sophisticated players, and that's where vaults come into the picture as a form of, one, distribution, and two, also abstracting away a lot of the challenges and complexities of the product. So as a business, how I see it is, it's obviously quite integral in the ecosystem. It helps us usher in the liquidity that fits the different parts of the spectrum in terms of, be it duration, be it risk, be it simplicity, and help us overall actually grow the ecosystem.
Yeah, so I guess I have a bit of a different take. Because we're an actively managed liquid hedge fund, we don't do any of strategies ourselves. But I think where vaults come in is because when you have spare cash, which is very common if you're an active manager, it's actually really, really useful to get yield on top of that, whether it's in vaults or like and Cindy said, the delta neutral strategies. So for example, Athena launched Binance Earn. They have like 12% on Binance. I don't know if you would classify that as a vault, but I think the product itself, where you have a delta neutral stablecoin that gives you 12% for holding SUSDE while you wait for the opportune time to go long on a perfect setup, is actually a really, really good way to generate yield on top of your returns, which I think is actually really underappreciated in this industry, because like you have a lot of funds and you have a lot of money that sometimes sits on the sidelines and they don't know what to do with it. And the emergence and the advancements of vaults have actually, I believe, provided stablecoins and the spare cash an avenue to deploy it. So personally, I benefit, like we benefit from it a lot. And yeah.
You made a good point around, how do you sort of draw the line between like a vault and like a stable coin and maybe like almost like a fund? Maybe they're all kind of one and the same, kind of feeling the elephant. I don't know how you guys sort of think about it, or how you maybe think about positioning. I know, Louis is obviously working on Yuzu, which is a new sort of yield-bearing stable coin, but also looks vault-like in some ways. I don't know how you guys think about it.
This is a good question. I think when I talk about Yuzu, this is top 3 frequently asked questions, which is, why a stablecoin and not a vault, right? And I would say that the number one answer that I give is the composability of certain things, right? With a stablecoin, you can suddenly do a lot of stuff. Obviously, you can call it like a tokenized vault in a way, where users can take it, if you're hyper degen, hyper aggressive, leverage it up 10x, right? If you want to risk tranche it, you can. You can bring it to Pendo. You can do many things with it. So suddenly the, I think, spectrum of users that you can cater to can go from the extremely conservative guy that just wants 10%, has various layers of liquidity buffers and protection, and just cares about security, all the way to the hyper degen guy that goes like 10x leverage, to the hilt, just on like 1% health factor. And so you're able to cater to the entire spectrum of, I think, risk users. And I think that's what differentiates a vault and a stablecoin.
I mean, also maybe on the topic of risk, I mean, Tarun, Gauntlet manages vaults across many different protocols. Obviously, a large part of that is you guys doing risk assessment and underwriting and helping diligence the strategy that you're employing. What do you see as like the most common mistakes that vault managers make? Like, it's, more of your competitors or the market more broadly?
I mean, I think it is actually the mistake that the Yearns made, which is duration management, right? Like fundamentally, so one thing I'll say about like the vault versus stablecoin thing, which I think is worth mentioning, is for a stablecoin, you have to pay some fraction of your yield in liquidity incentives. Because in order to actually be fully liquid at all times, in order for people to be willing to LP, in order for integrations with exchanges and stuff, you have to effectively pay out some of your yield. It's not like totally free. And so
You're saying like the reserve buffer basically eats into your yield.
yeah. Reserve exactly. Like in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a reserve buffer, whether it's incentives you're paying like directly, every stablecoin has a different way of chopping it up and redistributing it, but there's some amount you have to pay for demand liquidity, whereas vaults don't have to pay for that. But the converse of that is because you're not forced to think about liquidity, you mess up the duration management, right? And you basically are over allocated to yield product, and then your users can't withdraw for a certain amount of time. And I think fundamentally that has historically and continues to be the easiest mistake to make, because if you're constantly optimizing for like strict max yield and not risk and or liquidity, you will always just get stuck in these long duration things that you can never exit. And basically, to me, that's the fundamental separation between a vault and a stablecoin, is how much you have to think about duration management explicitly. Like that is the thing that separates them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess, Cindy, you also see multiple vaults operating on drift. What do you see as distinguishing, the great vault managers versus the maybe not so great vault managers?
I think one is capacity as well as the overall risk of the strategy. When I say capacity, it's like there are some strategies that, for instance, the funding rate altcoin arbitrage on sub 100K volume assets, right? Like you can only really take so much in those vaults. I think the best vaults scale really well. One example of that is the JLP vaults, which are very, very popular on Drift right now. You essentially deposit JLP, a yielding asset. You short the perps, and because open interest is so large on those assets, you can take really large amounts of capital in those. Funding rate altcoin ARPs may give you like 50%, 100% APR, but there's no capacity on those. And then we have some, like on the topic of stablecoin vaults, which are more delta neutral, you have to pay some level of treasury yields for that. And on the complete other side of the spectrum, you have things like trend following vaults or even 100x liquidity sniping vaults. Like I've seen some of those take place. They might do really well for a day, and you might annualize returns from those, but they see like an 80% drawdown the next day. So consistency of yields and the consistency of the strategy itself are similar ways that you would assess a hedge fund. And the best ones are high capacity, low risk, high turnover, and are able to deliver consistent returns.
I think maybe for folks in the audience who are maybe not spending all day looking at vaults like some of us on stage, what should they be looking for in terms of green flags and red flags when they're thinking about getting maybe some extra yield on their idle cash?
Yeah, I think what people should look for generally is just how long a vault manager has been operating, their reputation across multiple platforms, and what their max drawdown, what their Sharpe ratio looks like. Yeah, I would say those are the main things. Go ahead.
I think the historical track record of managing a vault, I think on this topic, I think as curators or vault managers get larger and larger, we're starting to see some recklessness in the way that they partner projects. We're starting to see, I think for the sake of growth, certain things in terms of risk metrics getting compromised in terms of, the kind of oracles they set up for various lending markets. I think these type of issues only surface when they become a problem, and that's when it's usually too late. So I think even for the retail crowd, don't just trust the size of the curator, but also, look at the quality and depth of research they've put out historically, the kind of signals they tend to give. Are they, independent in terms of calling out other projects or calling out other curators in terms of how they set up these markets? I think that's pretty key. I'm actually quite concerned about the larger vault ecosystem. I think someday we'll definitely see something happen, especially given that many of the curators, I think we've seen glimpses of it with, usual money on Morpho when they actually changed the value of the oracle. I think that could actually happen in a much larger magnitude someday. But I think the consolation here is many money markets founders or projects know this, and they're setting up the money markets to be isolated. So these risks at least can be contained at some point.
I think that's maybe a good point around sort of like the black swan risk around vaults is, hey, maybe there's some weirdness around someone having this sort of fixed oracle, and that's sort of causing the sort of cascading issues. Maybe on the other side, I mean, what do you think is like the biggest opportunity or sort of underserved market in vaults right now? Like, what are you personally excited to see?
I think that if now when everything is fine and dandy, a lot of folks think that these vaults are safe, etc., etc. And when something bad happens, I think that's when we tend to see the real cream float to the top, and we start to see the project stablecoins or vaults that actually survive these sort of storms because of layers of protection or defenses that they've set up. For example, for Yuzu Money, we insisted on developing a risk tranche because we know that there are a lot of unknown unknowns in crypto. And the last thing I want is I spend years of effort, millions of investors' money building a stablecoin, and an unknown happen. And that's the end of your project. Credibility is lost. We've seen that in the past cycle a lot. Many protocols, inverse finance, for example, had huge bad debt, took years for them to come back. And I think that's what separates the folks that are too hyper optimized for growth and neglecting some of these risk metrics versus the ones that really think about longevity, transparency, and risks for the long term.
I think we kind of didn't touch on the biggest topic about vaults, which I feel are neobanks. I think we're starting to see an emergence of something like that, where like the difference here is there's a specifically focus on distribution to retail while offering yield on the back end through DeFi. And for example, one is like EtherFi, is car, has cashback, but also like the money you put in it goes into their vaults. And I'm kind of excited for this because the last time I remember we had a decent neobank was Anchor, but like that blew up. But like 20% yield, right? And they had like a lot of retail interest. Even recently, Singapore had Chocolate Finance, which is like this debit card in Singapore. They had like they were under fire for breaching something. I can't quite remember what it was, but there's like clear PTSD there. But personally, I think it is a space that eventually we will start exploring when people are ready, because there are some really sound strategies that don't rely on like Ponzi-nomics to actually get yield from, and it's way more than the yield that people can get in their bank accounts right now, which I think is very valuable to offer to retail.
Yeah, I saw, even Coinbase rolled out Coinbase Lending recently, which is just a Morpho, effectively, just depositing USDC into Morpho. So it seems like a trend is getting, more and more mainstream.
Yeah.
I want to maybe switch gears a little bit. I was talking with Lewis a little bit before this about, as a VC, I'm getting a bunch of pitches for agents. Basically, hey, you talk to an agent, they will trade and run a strategy on your behalf that's sort of tailored to you. From my view, this is almost like antithetical to vaults, right? Instead of, hey, let's pool capital into like one strategy that everyone benefits from, let's have a million different bots running off chain, and they all sort of perform very similar strategies, but tailored to the individual people. How do you guys think about like an agentic sort of bot-focused universe versus it's kind of the current universe that we're in around vaults? Do you think they can kind of coexist? Do you think there's opportunities in agents? How do you think agents relate to your own business? Tarun, maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're constantly getting a lot of people who are like, hey, how do we like integrate your vaults with our agent? Most of the time, I think most agent protocols, like the life cycle of them is like, they're like, okay, we're just going to make an agent, and like, we don't have to think about any of the finance stuff. And then they try, and then they have the urine finance type of problems, or like, oh, they can't withdraw, or like they can't claim rewards that they thought they earned. And then their users are pissed at them. And then the version 2 is like, okay, let's use existing protocols, whatever. And then they're like, okay, well, we're not really beating the yield. They're just depositing in those protocols. And I think right now we're kind of at this thing where like a bunch of kind of the worst agents are dying, and the ones that are willing to like invest in like actually trying to find alpha across places are doing better. But realistically, they're going to like, I think of it as like a vault as a container, or DeFi protocol as a container hides a lot of the security stuff for you that you don't have to think about. Whereas like when you're in AI agent land, you're like writing code that could easily like blow up. And I generally think like vaults isolate all the security risks, both on the smart contract side and like the endpoint side, as well as like not having like the agent can just deposit in and allocate for you. So when you're talking about active fund managers, I'd say like something like 40%, 30 to 40% of our TBL daily turns over for people who are like either active managers or agents, and like that is only growing. So.
Is anyone maybe more optimistic or bullish on sort of agents, or are we all more Vault maxis?
I think the techno-optimist future is like you have agents running all these aggregation yield strategies for you, and you sit back and you tell them, hey, I'm looking for this type of return and this risk profile. You invest for me. And, we don't have to work a day of our lives again. Our entire lives are driven by yields from these strategies. Like, that's the optimistic future. I don't think we're there yet. I think agents can do some aggregation, but to be able to, like calculate the value of your points, to figure out exactly what to rebalance into, to which vaults are hot right now, which to assess the risk. I think it's a bit of a difficult task for the landscape today. So, but I'm optimistic of a future where every single person has a robo advisor that helps them get the types of returns on the capital they want.
I guess as we sort of are approaching the end of the panel, I'm curious what advice you would offer for people in the audience who maybe want to get involved in vaults, either maybe being event manager, maybe being an LP. Where would you kind of start if you're just curious about getting involved in vaults in 2025?
Definitely use them first. I feel like that seems like the obvious answer. I think the second thing is the space of vaults is expanding a lot, especially on the perpetual side and cross-chain side. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot more growth. Obviously, lending will grow, but I don't think the yields are going to be that attractive on the borrow side over time for it to kind of grow beyond where I don't see it growing 100x. I see it growing maybe 10x. But I think the perpetual side has the ability to potentially be 100x in total vault size. I mean, you already see this with Lighter and Drift, where it's the amount of capital, the velocity at which capital went into them was so much faster than the lending vaults. And so I think you have to include those in your universe.
Do you think basically every new protocol that's going to launch now is going to have their own sort of vaults?
Yeah, and the more fragmentation there is on, so if we take the version of the world which the DeFi optimist person like me believes is 20 to 30% of centralized exchange trading volume moves on chain to perpsexes. I'm using DEX in Airfos because they all, obviously the security models are all different, but in that world, you have tons of composability advantages for vaults, and you don't need to do all the lending and borrowing stuff that centralized exchanges do for their whales in that manner. Vaults are a natural way of facilitating that and offering these basis trades. So I just sort of think if you really believe centralized exchange volume moves on chain, the perps vaults can only grow a lot more than they are now.
Absolutely. I think try them out. We have a big announcement coming later today as well, where there's going to be a new type of vaults to invest into, where you can get kind of the returns of MMs farming and providing liquidity for all these perp dexes. I do think the landscape is going to grow a lot. Right now, we're only seeing perp and spot type of vaults, but you might see options being added into the mix as well. You might see different types of hedging mechanisms and really exotic things come to light. So I'm excited for the future. But for now, definitely try them out at your own risk.
Minor alpha leak this early in the morning. Pay attention. Lewis, what do you think?
I think with any financial product, it's a cliche, but definitely do your own research. I think these are not simple products. Really understand what you're getting into. Don't just look at the headline yield number and get into it. Do your own research, figure out the terms and conditions, the withdrawals, the liquidity. And most importantly, I think, start small, get your hands dirty before you really dive in.
I think everyone has made very good points. I fully agree with Lewis. I think one of my favorite quotes is protect your downside and the upside will take care of itself. And that is especially true in vault products. Definitely try them with small amounts first. If you get burned, at least you don't lose everything. And then you can slowly, as you get more experience with these things, put in more money. Yeah.
Maybe that's a good note to end on. Thank you to our panelists for kicking us off this morning. Can we get a quick round of applause?